All right, we're live. Okay, so here we are on our first digital excursion into trying to take one of these lectures, so that way you won't have to come into class if you're in an online class or a hybrid class, or you've got some kind of digital experience for history. We're going to try to get some of my lectures here, so that way you can view them without having to come. So we're going to start here with American History 1. We've got our first set of lectures. And if you go through all of the lecture slides that are available on the course website, you'll notice that I try to, on the first slide of every session, give you a whole long list of bullet points for key terms for you to pay attention to in the reading. Some will be longer than others. This isn't necessarily an assignment, but as you're going through and you're doing the reading and you come across one of these terms, hey, he had these on the slides. Maybe I should pay attention to these. And so they're just designed to help you focus your thoughts, and then also these are the ones that I start pulling exam questions from later in the course. So it's a pretty good idea to try to look at all of these. Now for our topic, the first bit of American History 1, we're going to start with the three major cultures that come together to form the American experience. And of course we're going to start with the American Indians. They are the first people to arrive here in North America, and so we're going to start with their culture as they begin as we begin talking about them. We're going to talk about Europeans, who are eventually going to come into the story as well, what their world was, politically, religiously, culturally, economically, and then we're also going to talk about West Africa. What was medieval Africa like? Who are these people? How are they living their lives? And of course, we're going to be talking about the endemic system of West African slavery. But then, we're going to, starting in the 1500s, we're going to bring all these three cultures together, and we're going to talk about what happens with that, and then we're going to bring forward, especially focusing ever increasingly on North American colonization by the English, and how that colonization goes forward. Who are these colonists? Most of them are from England, not necessarily all of them, but then what happens in regard to the spread of African slavery, and how these colonists continue to push into this area as well. And as we get then into the late 1600s and then on into the early 1700s, we'll see a bunch of changes will take place with American colonialism there. So that's where we'll get started. And one of the things we have to understand about America is that no one is from here. Not even the American Indians, right? We are all descended from immigrants. At one point, North America was completely devoid of any human forms whatsoever until the in-migration of the first Americans, and that would be what we would call the American Indians. I typically don't use the term Native Americans because it's an imprecise term. Anybody who was born in America is technically a Native American. I'm a Native American. I was born here. But there isn't really an actually accurate term that, for example, American Indians would use to describe themselves in the way that we describe them now, which is all the red people who lived in North and South America before anybody else showed up. They had tribal names for themselves, but that's not really the description that we typically use. So since there isn't a good one, I usually use the term American Indian for that one. So when we look at the migration here of the American Indians, somewhere right around 33,000 years ago, we're going to see that the world was a radically different place. Now, nobody tell Al Gore this, but the Earth heats up and cools off all by itself. And if you want to see how this changes the Earth around it, is when periods of big-time cooling take place, a lot of the water that happens to be in the ocean will freeze up and come onto dry land in the form of glaciers. And if you want to run this little experiment yourself, what you can do is get yourself a big glass of Coke and then put a whole bunch of ice in it. And when you put the ice in it, the level of the liquid goes up, and then when you take the ice out of it and put it someplace else, the level of the water goes down. Or, if you want to do what happens to a lot of places every single year, is you just watch the ice melt, in which case the level stays the same. It's a fun little science experiment, especially if you get to drink a whole bunch of soda when you're done with it. But basically the same thing happens to the world's oceans. And there are periodic changes throughout the history of planet Earth where the ocean levels will go up to basically where they are now, and then they'll go down. And when they go down, in many cases, parts of the sea floor are exposed that would normally be underwater. Florida, for example, during this period is a lot bigger. It's about 2 to 3 times as large as it would be right now. But also, particularly of interest to us, is the territory between Alaska and Siberia. Because during these periods where the level of the ocean goes down, a lot of what would normally be the seafloor actually is exposed. And during this period, and our best guess, some anthropologists say no, it's about 15,000 years ago, and some say no, we got dates of sites that are 25,000 years ago, some say no, it's got to be pushed back farther, 33,000 years ago. Anyway, the date isn't terribly important unless you're going to be an anthropologist, in which case it's super important. But at some point, we're going to see that tribal Neolithic cultures living in central and eastern Siberia had been following large herds of especially woolly mammoth. And when the Bering Land Bridge is exposed, grass begins to grow on it, plants begin to grow on it, and so the woolly mammoth begins to migrate onto it and thus migrating into Alaska. Well, the Neolithic culture of these Siberian hunter-gatherers was dependent upon the mammoth, and so naturally they follow them across. Okay? They follow them across the Bering Land Bridge into what is now Alaska and thus North America. So at some point, though, the Ice Age is going to end. So all of, well, not all of, but a lot of the glacial ice that's locked up on land is then going to run back off. It's going to melt and go back into the ocean, and the ocean is going to come back up. And the map is going to look a lot like the way that you and I know it to look today. And that is that instead of sort of one connected continent, we have now two separated continents again. And thus, these people are going to be trapped now in North and South America and relatively isolated from the rest of world culture. And they're going to spread out very, very quickly. Some anthropologists think that within 1,000 years they had completely populated two whole continents of North and South America because they can find sites where people had been living for quite some time. Now, when we look at the culture of these people, they are what we would refer to as a Neolithic culture, which means a new Stone Age culture. They do not use metal tools. They are using stone, wood, bone implements that they can get from the environment around them. They also are a hunter-gatherer society, at least initially, which is these are groups of people that don't live in one place. They do not domesticate plants or animals. That they go out and they hunt animals for their protein needs, and they go out and they gather the plants that are in their area. But that forces them to move around a lot. So this is going to be a very, very successful move for them as they have no human competition in either North or South America. So as they move across, we're going to see that some big, big changes are going to happen. And in fact, some of what we look at with American Indian culture is sort of what we would expect if you've watched a lot of maybe old Western movies. There are going to be some of these groups of Indians that are going to be living in sort of teepees, still living in a hunter-gatherer kind of environment. But in fact, by 1492, and this is not an arbitrary date that we sort of pick out of a hat, by 1492, we're going to see that the American Indians had created many, many impressive civilizations. That many of them had abandoned hunter-gatherer lifestyle and, in fact, moved to these large urban areas. In fact, American Indian civilizations had been around for so long that in some cases, in places like northern South America and in Central America and Mesoamerica, they had had time to rise to great prominence and then fall apart and rise again and then fall apart and then be replaced by the civilizations that the Spanish would encounter when they are the first European explorers to move into the area. Now, all of these cultures, just like every culture on the planet, adapts to fit their environment. So, for example, if you're going to look at all American Indian cultures across North and South America, for example, the Inuit that are living in Alaska, they're eating whale and they're wearing a lot of fur. Well, that makes a lot of sense because it's freaking cold there and they've got a lot of whale. So they're adapting their culture to live and fit in with their environment. Whereas, for example, the Temuco Indians of northern Florida are walking around essentially nude, and they're eating deer, and they're gathering the plants and animals that you would find here in Florida because it's freaking hot here. So that's the way that it works out for these people as well. But as we see as a general trend around a lot of what we would call medieval world cultures, urbanization, civilization, in fact, is taking place in large number. Now, most of them, we guess, based on our anthropological studies, most of them are still hunter-gatherers. But that's all basically in relationship to the civilizing influences that you see around the world, which is a surplus of agriculture. In places like Mesoamerica, where you've got a lot of corn, also you can see the same thing around Cahokia in central northern America, or you've got a surplus of agriculture, and also Western South America, any of these places where you can have large-scale production of food, you're going to see cities. All right. Now, what's interesting here is even when you look at the great sort of cities of the Aztec or the Inca or some of these other great cultures, all of them are still Neolithic. You do see some use of metal, but generally speaking, you don't have it in large-scale use like you'll see in other cultures around the world. So you don't have huge construction techniques that you would see elsewhere, and yet they're still able to build these, monumental cities, these huge stone pyramid temples, giant, aqueducts and causeways. They're able to terraform lakes. It's pretty impressive, the fact that they're only able to use stone implements. Now, of the cultures that are in existence at the time of first contact with the Europeans, the Aztecs are probably the ones that we would say was kind of the most impressive. They had a huge capital city. This is, you can see in the photo here at the top, this is their capital city of Tenochtitlan. The modern city of Mexico City in central Mexico, which is the capital of Mexico, sits on top of what used to be Tenochtitlan. And it was this giant lake that the Aztecs had built, started building their city on an island in the middle of this lake, but as their civilization got bigger and bigger and bigger, they had to terraform the lake, and eventually they would connect the lake through several concrete causeways to the mainland. But not only do they have impressive physical infrastructural accomplishments, but also they have a strong political network, a far-flung empire, regular military, strong trade missions that they send out all throughout Central America, and they had a great deal of control. So politically they were pretty advanced as well. Now all of these groups are what we would generally sort of lump into, which would be polytheism, which is the worship of many gods. But specific to the Native American experience is going to be worshiping especially spirits of nature and also ancestor worship. And it's a little too broad of a brush to say, well, all American Indian cultures and religions were this way. But if we're going to give it sort of broad strokes, we generally refer to this as a form of polytheism, nature spirits, ancestor spirits, not terribly different than what you'll see in medieval West Africa. Now, again, if your suppositions about Africa just basically come from the things that National Geographic magazine thinks are interesting, or if you see some of those documentaries on TV, you say, well, what is that? What does sub-Saharan Africa look like? You say, well, it's just poor kids. Sally Struthers wants us to send them some rice or something like that. It's just ridiculously horrible. I see these videos on the internet where they've got like warlords running around, blowing people away. Everybody's in poverty. It's just ridiculously awful. Or if you're really got kind of a backwards idea, well, they're living in huts and they're like fighting off lions with sticks, right? So if I were to then ask you to dial the clock back and say, well, what did Africa look like in the 1400s? So, well, these guys they're living in mud, right, up to their chins, right? I mean, there's nothing going on. In fact, medieval West Africa looked a whole lot like medieval Europe in a lot of ways. You have strong nation states that are developing with trade ties between themselves and also with regions that are outside of West Africa, walled cities, regular militaries, monarchies with extended family groups that are running these countries. In fact, a good print here, this Portuguese print here from the 1400s, gives us an idea of kind of what medieval West Africa would look like. And it looks a whole lot like a print that you might see medieval France or something like that, where you've got walled cities, you've got a king on the throne, he's got a golden scepter. Other than the fact that it's a black guy and not a white guy, we would expect, yeah, medieval Europe. He's just somebody colored the frame wrong. But no, in fact, this is what you would expect to see in medieval West Africa. And politically, at this point, the three kind of major dominant kingdoms of West Africa are Congo, Benin, and Songhai. There are a few other ones, and they go through some evolutions. But for our purposes for this class, we can kind of limit them down to that. Now, one of the things, though, that's endemic to West Africa is gold. And while we think that would be really great to just be able to find gold lying on the ground, part of the reason that gold is useful is because it's scarce. And so if you go to some of these areas still today that have a lot of gold in the area, you'll see, for example, these sort of work women, these washerwomen, they're walking around the streets and they don't even have shoes on, but they've got these huge like beaten gold earrings and gold necklaces, and you say, listen, sister, maybe it'd be a good idea to buy some sandals or something first instead of that, because obviously you've got a lot of money to buy all that jewelry, but in places where gold is plentiful, It's nothing to get a gold necklace, but leather shoes, they take a lot of work. You know, you have to pay somebody in something valuable. So what you're going to see is ever increasingly is these kings and these nation states of West Africa realize that gold isn't all that valuable where they are, but if they can trade it to people who want it, and this is going to be the rest of Africa, and then also through Egypt, trade with the Middle East, they can enrich themselves. And so ever increasingly, what you're seeing here is by the 1400s, medieval West Africa is beginning to really feel its power economically through its trade connections across sub-Saharan Africa and then across the Sahara into the Middle East. Now, if you want to look at the cultural factors that are going on kind of the ground level, you have really two kind of religious activities that are going on, and it's a good way to think about it would be like oil and water. You can put both of them in the same container, but they won't mix. One will sit right on top of the other. And these two strata are spirit worship, and you would typically find that among kind of the average people. Most of the people that you would see here in medieval West Africa would be in some kind of spirit worship. You see this sometimes evidenced by spirit masks. You can find this both in American Indian culture and then also in medieval African culture. Ancestor worship, connection with people that had passed away that were in your family. The idea was that you could make spiritual connections with them. The upper nobility and the rulers, however, are ever increasingly tending towards Islam. And the reason for that is as West Africa is gaining wealth and prominence, they, like a lot of emerging places in the world today, they want to send their children, who are going to be the future rulers, off to get educated by the best educators in the world. And so, like today, many people in the Middle East that are oil sheiks, they will send their kids off to Paris or London or something like that to get educated at the best universities in Europe, or perhaps here in the United States. These guys were sending their children off to the Middle East. The Middle East at this point, the Muslim world, flowering with a great deal of intellectual fervor, and so they're going to send their guys off to the smartest people available, and it shouldn't surprise you that they're going to come back as Muslims. The assumption was amongst a lot of these people that, well, Islam is the religion of the smart people. And so ever increasingly what you're seeing here is among the ruling class, you will see an idea that they are going to lean towards Islam. Now that, I don't want to paint this with sort of boilerplate that all these guys, all the rulers were Muslim and all the people were spirit worshippers. You see some bleed over in some areas. You also see some rulers that had not decided to move towards Islam. This is a period that culturally they're in flux. One of the other points that we've got to understand about medieval West Africa is it has an indigenous slave system. Slavery existed in West Africa, like much of the rest of the world at this point, and still today, here in the 21st century, in that slaves were an economic commodity. Typically speaking, the number one way to become a slave at this point in world history, or all the way back to, say, the Trojan War in the Archaic period, or even today, and that was warfare. Warfare, or being grabbed by sort of bad people who are not afraid to use violence against you. And these slaves, of course, are going to be traded between kingdoms. They're going to be used as units of economic measurement, the ability for them to produce something. You also see that if you capture someone of high value, like a prince or something like that, they can be used as a hostage. But slavery was part and parcel with the economic system. So you've got gold, trade in foodstuffs, trade in commercially work manufacture, and trade in slaves going between all these different places. So that's going to be important for us in our discussion of colonial America. All right? Now, the reason that these guys in West Africa become important is because of, first, the intrusion of Europeans. Now, many of you, those of you who managed to sort of pay attention and stay awake through American history in high school, you said, I thought the Spanish were involved, right? For those of you who don't know, Portugal is this little rump territory on the western end of the Iberian Peninsula. It's mostly surrounded by Spain to the east and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. And the real stimulating point for a lot of these people here in Europe during this Age of Exploration was China, all right? And what they want to do is be able to get to China and trade for all the really, really good things that China has. Gold, silk, spices, jade, all these kinds of things that are in short supply in Europe. And if you can bring them back to Europe, you can make a lot of money. Now, this is a point in world history where people were concerned with making a lot of money. Now I know that's really not as much of a concern for people to want to try to make a lot of cash, but at this point they were really, really interested in it. And so the Portuguese began to explore for this trade route to try to get to Asia. The only problem was somebody put Africa in the way. So the idea that many of these people had was, well, at some point, if you go south down the African coast, Africa will end, and you'll be able to turn east and get to China that way. The only problem was they didn't have Google Earth to sort of zoom in and say, well, where exactly are we? How are we going to get down there? And so they're going to have to explore the West African coast to figure out how far down does Africa actually go? Because many of the maps that they had were really bad. All right. Now, one of the things that you've got to understand, though, is the Portuguese and basically all of these people during this period of exploration are all in some kind of sailing vessel. All right, whether it's a caravel or some other type of ship, they've got to go where the wind and the water will allow them to go. You see, when you're in a sailboat, when you're in a sailing vessel, and the wind is blowing from the south, you're not going to go south. It's not going to happen. You go north, west, or east. You can have it blow directly behind you. You can have the wind blow sort of across the beam from one side or the other, but you just can't go into the wind. I mean, technically, you can sort of tack a little bit towards it and a little bit towards it. You can zigzag and make very, very slow progress in your process of going south, but you're not going to make any kind of speed going into the wind. And the problem, of course, is that most of the winds off the West African coast blow from the south, which means you're trying to spend a lot of time going directly into the wind. And of course, once you get around the equator, the winds tend to die off altogether. And so unless you want to get out and push or something, you're not going to go very far in a sailing vessel with either contrary or no winds whatsoever. So what happens here is as these Portuguese begin to explore the West African coast, this brings them into contact with these West African kingdoms. And they're going to begin the idea of trading with these people. Now, the earliest trade connections that are going to take place between the Portuguese and the West Africans are not necessarily for the idea of making them rich. They're trying to get to China. That's going to get them rich. Africa is an obstacle that they have to deal with. It's a hurdle they have to jump over. And so one of the problems is, as they're making slow progress down the West African coast, how do you get enough food and fresh water? Where are places that we can put in to repair our ships? And so as they are sort of pushing down the West African coastline, much of the trade connections you're going to see during the early part of this period with these West African kingdoms is for that purpose, is for keeping their fleet of ships continuing to explore towards the south. And these West African kings, they realize that there are a few things, metal tools, firearms, some other things that the Europeans have that they would like to trade, and so they trade away, in many cases, these coastal or coastal island areas that the Portuguese begin to colonize. Now, the whole purpose, again, of these colonies was to produce food, to produce the supplies that they would need to keep their navy going. But one of the other things that they run into problems of is, well, how do we make this cost effective, right? Because, I mean, if it becomes too expensive to try to get around Africa, then we might as well forget about it. One of the economic trades that begins to take place is the African kings begin to sell slaves that they, of course, had captured in war to the Portuguese. I mean, they were trading slaves amongst each other. Why not to the Portuguese, right? If you can make money off of trading slaves to them, then you might as well take it. And that is how we're going to see that for the first point, African slaves begin moving off the African continent slightly. They're not across the Atlantic yet, but they're beginning to make this migration. And of course, the African kings are going to set up plantations for these Portuguese in order to be able to produce these cash crops. One of the things that's very interesting is many of these plantations, which are these self-sustaining agricultural factories basically, is that they become so efficient that the Portuguese actually begin making money off of the plantations here in West Africa. Now, one of the points you do have to understand, though, is the fact that for the most part, white Europeans have to stay off the coast of Africa. You're not going to see any large-scale incursions into the interior of Africa for one very good reason, and that is disease. Disease killed white people like it was a full-time job until the 1800s when people figured out what actually caused diseases. Those are the little microbes that, for example, mosquitoes inject into you or various other ways that you get microbes into your body. Once they figured that out with germ theory, then all of a sudden you're going to see massive colonialism from Europe into Africa. But until then, white Europeans are going to have to stay kind of off the coast in any kind of large numbers for this. But we now have contact between Europe and between West Africa, and we're going to see how this begins to evolve. But first, we've got to understand who these Europeans are. Here in the 1400s, Europe is beginning to emerge from the Dark Ages, or the medieval period. And this is a time that is marked in Central and Southern Europe by what we would refer to as the Renaissance. That would eventually sort of expand upward into Germany and France and Switzerland and England in the 1500s. But if you were to look at the culture of medieval Europe, and if you just didn't know anything about it, you'll notice that the culture of medieval Europe is dominated by the Catholic Church. So we notice that Christianity, specifically Catholic Christianity, is going to be one of the dominant factors, not only culturally, but as we're also going to see, politically. The Catholic Church is a very powerful political player. That doesn't mean they always get what they want, but they're someone that you have to take into consideration into what you're doing. One of the problems with this, so by the time you get to the 1400s, is that Catholicism is rocked by problems outside of Europe and inside of Europe. The problems that are besetting Catholicism outside of Europe is Islam. Starting in the 700s, Islam makes a series of assaults on Europe from the south. They invade Spain, and Spain would then later fight a multi-century civil war between Spanish Muslims and Spanish Catholics. Spanish Catholics are going to win that. But this is a major land war that begins to take place here as well. We're also going to see that Muslim sailors assault the southern Italian coastline, various other places around this area as well. The Ottoman Empire would later take control of Greece. And so there's a strong sense here in Catholic Europe that they've kind of got a siege mentality, that they represent the true belief system of the world, and that they're being now attacked by what they view as agents of the devil. Well, starting here in the early 1500s, we're also going to see an internal problem, which is the beginning of the Reformation movement that would be started by a little German priest named Martin Luther that would later spread to guys like John Calvin, Eric Zwingli, stuff like that. And so the official position of the Catholic Church was not that, well, you know, we're Catholics and they're Baptists or Lutherans or whatever, and, you know, we all just kind of get along. No, it was that the Catholic Church, the one unified church, was the only true church, and anybody that tried to do anything different was an agent of Satan. So this is particularly problematic for a lot of these people. So when we look at this period of colonialism that's going to follow, religious fanaticism on the part of the Catholic, especially Spaniards, that take place, we kind of scratch our heads at here in this modern era. But if you look at it from the perspective of these guys that are going to be coming over from Europe into the Americas, it makes a lot of sense. I'm not saying that you have to agree with it. I'm just saying you need to understand it. All right? Now, politically, what we're seeing ever increasingly is the transformation of kingdoms into nations. A kingdom is pretty easy to understand. You've got a king, the area that he controls, that's a kingdom. And in some cases, if you look at the map of Europe, many of these areas that kings control, they didn't touch each other, sort of like a jigsaw puzzle map, but that's what it is. You've got the king, he's in charge of it, you've got a nobility. But a nation is something different, all right? A nation is a group of people that have similar language, custom, history, culture. And what we're seeing here is this evolution that's taking place here in the 1400s, that ever increasingly, kingdoms are becoming these nations. You'll have a national kingdom. And if you take, for example, my World History 2 class, we'll talk about how eventually kings become subsumed into their nations. Nations and leaders, though, at this point exist in a world of competition, specifically competition for power. Now, when we look at money is one of the ways that these guys can compete with each other. Not for the necessarily, well, I want a bigger palace, or I would really like a gold chariot rather than a silver chariot, although I'm sure that was really nice. This is one way for these monarchs to compete against each other. For a long time, Europe had existed in a situation of strife, where these guys are going to be fighting each other for control of land. But basically, all of this is a power struggle. All right? So when we look at how these trade relationships exist with one another, their militaries, their trade, their political stances, even their relationship to religion are all a function of how do I get more power for me and my kingdom or for my nation. And so one of the things that they notice about trade as it begins to pick up throughout the 1400s is trade equals wealth. This is one of the great economic maxims that I like to pound into students. So now that you're sort of trapped watching this video, you get it pounded into you too. And that is trade equals wealth. So more trade equals more wealth. All right? And so if there's a way to get more trade to take place, this is going to cause a lot of people to explore more for economic gain. The aforementioned idea that if we can reach China, that would be a whole new trading outlet that we don't really have right now that would lead to more wealth for us. Into this comes a little Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, who would be an immigrant into Spain. Now, many people, sort of the common held knowledge is that Christopher Columbus proved to the rest of the world thought the earth was flat like a pancake, and if they said, no, you can't sail west across the land, if you do, you fall off, and you go off. So gravity sort of pulls us down, that we're sort of an island, a flat island floating in space. Nobody with any serious amount of education thought that, and even the most ignorant sailor on Earth knew that the Earth was not flat, because all you have to do is climb up into the rigging of one of these sailing vessels, and as you're the lookout, when you see another ship coming at you, it's not a dot that sort of gets bigger, like it's coming straight at you. First you see the top sails, and then you see the main sails, and then eventually you see the hull, and then eventually the whole ship comes over the horizon. And so if you've got eyes good enough, anybody can see that the Earth is round, or globular, like a basketball, rather than flat, like the desk. So when Columbus proposes the idea that people sail west across the Atlantic to reach China that way, the problem that people hit him with was not, you're going to sail off the edge of the Earth, you're going to fall in the area with sea serpents. It was not that, okay? It was, how big is the Earth? For a long time, people have been trying to calculate how big the Earth was, because like I said, for a long, long time, people have figured out the Earth was round. The question is, how big around is it? Now, for those of you who paid attention in trigonometry, I'm not one of those people, but all you have to do is if you can measure a distance along an arc of a globe, right, and then you can calculate the curve of that arc, then you can get the entire length of the circle. And thus, you can get, for example, the equatorial distance across the Earth. And people have been trying to do this for centuries. In fact, one of the Ptolemaic scientists in the 2nd century had come up with his calculation, which was within about 2% of what you will find if you go around the Earth today. And a lot of people had done this calculation, and generally, most of them were right. The Earth is pretty big. And the only problem that they had with telling Columbus was, no, you're a fool, you can't cross the ocean's too large, is they didn't know about North America and South America. While it is true that the Vikings had been to North America, they hadn't bothered to tell anybody. And to be fair, I don't know that the Vikings really knew that they had found anything new as well. So, when you put a map together using the calculations that most of these cartographers of the day would have had, you would have made the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, basically put them together. And you would have been looking at this massive body of water between Spain and China. And they would have come to Christopher Columbus when he was saying, hey, let's sail west across the Atlantic to get to China. And they said, no, the ocean is too huge. You will run out of food and water before you get there. So that was the actual problem. But one of the things that Christopher Columbus proves is it's not always good to be right every time. See, Christopher Columbus had done his own math on the circumference of the Earth and had come up with a wrong answer. According to his math, the Earth was about 25% smaller than what it actually is. And so by his calculations, China would be roughly where the east coast of the United States is today. And he said, we can cross that distance in about 6 weeks. That's a very makeable trip. And of course, a lot of these people, they shook their head, no, you're an idiot. No, we've done the math. The ocean's much, much bigger than that. And so Columbus kicks around Spain for quite some time trying to find funding. Eventually, he impresses upon the Queen of Spain, Isabella. He puts to her, he said, look, you can have one really expensive party at the palace for the cost of the trip that I'm asking you to fund. You'll just lose out on one sort of wild night at the palace, and if I fail, no big deal. You're out one night of fun. but if I succeed and bring back the riches of China, then it'll all be worth it. And so she agrees to the mission. She puts him in charge of this, and she commissions him. The idea is that he was supposed to spread the Catholic faith, increase the land holding by taking territory in the Far East, and then, of course, establishing trade links with Asia as well. Well, across the ocean, Columbus is kind of in his element. He's a pretty good sea captain. He keeps his sailors going forward. Many of them had sort of determined when they reached the halfway point that, all right, that's it. You know, we don't want to keep going, and he keeps them moving forward. You know, he sort of appeals to their sense of history. And they finally arrive in the Caribbean. We're not exactly sure which island he is the first one that he makes sight of, but he will move ashore. He will move ashore in October of 1492, and he makes contact with the New World. Now, according to Columbus's calculations, he should have been off the coast of India. And so, when you go ashore and you find a bunch of dark people running around and you think you're off the coast of India, what do you call them? Indians. Call them in Spanish El Indios. The name has stuck, despite the fact that most American Indians have never been to India, although we do see some Indians running around America today. Anyway, it's best not to confuse yourself with this. Just understand, Columbus called them Indians. The name stuck. That's what we've got to deal with today. If you don't like it, tough. Invent a time machine and go fix it. All right. What we're going to see, though, is Columbus doesn't find exactly what he's looking for. All right, he's looking for gold. He's looking for the riches of the Far East. And if you go into the Caribbean today, unless you go to like I don't know, the Bombay Company or something in the mall, you're not going to find it. Okay, none of that kind of stuff is there with the Taino Indians that he runs into, and so he's a little stymied. He would later make a series of trips to the New World. And he's able to do sort of the best that he can, at least from his own perspective, which is colonization. He takes over large numbers of the indigenous population, and this is going to begin this period of Spanish colonization, starting here with its epicenter in the Caribbean and eventually outward. That would eventually lead us to a massive Spanish overseas empire that would range from the latitude of Florida, Texas, and California, all the way down to the southern tip of South America. The only exception to that is, of course, Brazil. Portugal is a little ticked that Spain is running up this huge imperial success rate, and they begin to complain and say, wait a minute, we're the ones that pioneered all these techniques of exploration. We're the ones that made the connection to China by going around Africa, and now Spain moves in and they sort of blunder into two continents. This isn't fair. Looks like a war is going to break out, and actually the Pope is going to intervene, and he says, listen, isn't there enough land on two continents to go around? And so Brazil is going to go over to Portugal, which is why, if you guys, when you go on spring break, if you want it in South America, most of South America speaks Spanish to this day, except for Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. I love this scene here of Columbus's first meeting with the Taino Indians here in the Caribbean. And again, when we talk about primary sources and things like that, this is not a photograph. Okay, so this is an artist rendering. Guy probably wasn't even there. But the reason I include this is it gives you an idea of kind of what is going on, and you've got these two worlds that are going to collide with one another rather abruptly here. On the left-hand side, you've got the Europeans, and they've got armor, and they've got Western clothing, they've got Christianity, they've got their ships, they've got their guns. And on the eastern half of the photo here, you've got the Indians. They've got their dress, and they've got their methods and manners. But when you look around the scene, there's a lot that's kind of going on that is going to be taken in two very different ways. One of the favorites that I like to point out here is one of the first things that, of course, these guys are doing, at least in the picture, is they're establishing Christianity. They're setting up the cross, right? Which, if you're a Catholic Spaniard in 1492, this is a powerful image, right? Jesus is here. Right? Christianity is here. We're planting it here. And it means a lot. It means a lot to the Spaniards. Right? Now, if you're the Indians, this means nothing. This is weird. Right? Look, they stuck sticks in the ground. Okay? They probably figured out pretty quickly that it had great meaning to the Spaniards, but not so much to them. Right? The Spaniards themselves, you can see, are dressed. They've got their helmets on, and they've got their guns on their shoulder, and they've got their spears, and they've got their armor, and maybe they're worry that like a rugby match is going to get out of hand or something like that. No, they're dressed for warfare, right? The Indians are not, okay? But one of the areas that you'll notice directly here in the frame that the artist decides to include is the one area that they are going to intersect, that they understand pretty quickly, is trade. Hey, these are new people. I bet they have new stuff that we don't have, and I bet we've got some stuff that they don't have, and you're going to see that they're going to try to trade pretty quickly. So you can learn a lot from little insights like this. But Columbus's discovery is going to set off a movement here in the 1500s that is the conquistador movement. We get our English cognate, conquest, from the term conquistador, right? And generally speaking, when we look at these conquistadors, these guys that are going to come over from Spain, they're typically motivated by what we often describe as the three G's: gold, glory, and God. And I remain convinced that historians came up with that so that undergraduates could pass their exams. Right? It's a convenient little mnemonic device that's easy to remember on exam day. Right? The idea was that many of these guys were middling kind of Spanish officers that, if they had gone through their career, they had topped out maybe at like what we would refer to as like a lieutenant colonel or a colonel or something like that. But most of these guys are going to be the famous conquistadors. They weren't born into positions of power and wealth. They were never going to be, Duke so-and-so or Lord whatever his name is, right? Senor Don. It just wasn't going to happen to them, okay? They weren't born into the right families. They didn't have the right political connections. They were in the army. They were going to serve in the army. They were going to have an okay career, and that was going to be kind of it. The discovery of North and South America and these huge areas that are open for conquest, and the fact that God himself seems to give permission to it, is a major motivating factor. All of a sudden now, they've got a place that they can make great riches for themselves and their family, earn a position of political prestige that would have been completely closed off to them because of their birth. And like I said, it looks like Jesus himself has given the old stamp of approval to this kind of thing. Right? Now, the most famous of all of these was Hernan Cortez. Cortez was the deputy commander of an expedition that was supposed to set out from Cuba. His boss had left him in charge. He says, okay, you stay here. I'm going to go get some more guys. We're going to go get some more stuff, and then we'll leave when I get back. That, of course, meant that Cortez, while the guy was gone, left. Left across the Gulf of Mexico and landed on the east coast of what you and I would refer to as Mexico today, the shores of the Aztec Empire, and he has 400 men. He has 400 Spaniards with him. He sends back a very small number on one of the ships to take the message back to his boss to let him know what he's done. And then the rest of the ships he burns in front of his men. As a result of that, his men are very highly motivated because they are now surrounded by the entire Aztec Empire of approximately 28 million Aztecs. So, for those of you who are handicapping this at home, 400 Spaniards versus 28 million Aztecs seems like the odds are pretty long. But Cortez has a specific goal in mind. Right? He marches his men straight into Aztec territory. He figures out where the capital is, and he moves towards it unswervingly. Now, they will eventually. The Aztecs are kind of taken aback by this, right? You got white people getting off these giant ships. They've got the gleaming metal armor. Many of these guys had never seen a horse before, and so they were somewhat surprised when a guy who was riding a horse they would get off the horse. They thought it was sort of one mythical animal altogether. And so this is a strong bit of culture shock for the Aztecs and for the Spaniards as well. And so in some cases, as they're marching from east to west towards Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, in some cases the sort of the villages kind of melt away from them. You don't want to have anything to do with these people. It's crazy, freaky stuff. In some cases, we should also not be surprised that warriors come out to try to oppose them. That they recognize that these are foreigners. These are not people that are supposed to be here, and so they oppose them. And you'll get an idea in some of these early skirmishes between the Spaniards and the Aztecs of sort of two different modes of warfare. All right, the mode of warfare for an Aztec is you've got these sort of brightly colored feathers, you've got these giant headdresses, you get a scary multicolored war paint, you paint it all over yourself. And you get your weapons, and one of the first things you do is you jump out and you scream at the enemy. The idea is gain a psychological advantage over the enemy, give them an opportunity to surrender, be your slave rather than die, forced them to withdraw, something like that. So this is the message, okay, in warfare that the Aztec warrior is trying to send to his opponent. That I'm big, I'm scary, I'm frightening, and you should cower before my awesomeness. Okay. The response they get from the Spaniards were they just shoot them, pow, and it's easy. And you get misunderstanding on both sides. Okay, you get misunderstanding on both sides because the Aztec, he just shot him. You just killed him. You didn't, because one of the main things in Aztec warfare was to capture slaves. You don't kill somebody unless you absolutely have to. You just shot him. What's the deal with that? You didn't give him a chance to surrender either. You just killed him. Okay, and of course on the Spanish side, it obviously is a lot better than the guy getting shot. But they're kind of like, he just jumped out and I shot him. These guys are stupid. Well, maybe he was a crazy one. They keep doing it, and we keep shooting him. Are they not getting how this works? The boomsticks are going to kill you. And so, it was pretty wild kind of stuff. Eventually, what you'll see is Cortez and his entourage, they would arrive at the capital of Tenochtitlan. The speaker, or for lack of a better term, the emperor of the Aztec Empire, Moctezuma, or as we would say in English, Montezuma, sort of welcomes them in. He's got a lot of questions about them. Are they this Quetzalcoatl god that has been prophesied to take down the Aztec Empire or not? And so he brings them in, and of course immediately they grab him and they say, okay, you're our prisoner, you got to do what we say. We've seized control now of the Aztec Empire. And they would hold Tenochtitlan hostage for quite some time, but then eventually the Aztecs, we don't really like these. It's pretty obvious the Spaniards are in charge. We don't like that, and they would ambush these guys one night. They would kick them out of the city, force them to the south of the shores where a very large Aztec army is waiting for them, and so it looks like the jig is up, right? The Spanish is sort of beaten up and tossed out of the city. Their numbers have been reduced, and now, of course, they're faced with a massive Aztec army. But Cortez keeps his wits about him. He charges his army right directly into the center of the Aztec formation, pulls down one of their battle flags, which to a European army, that would be, man, they took our flag, that's bad, okay? It would cause some confusion because, you don't have your normal rally point. It maybe even cause a little bit of psychological damage. Man, they took our flag, that's a real bummer, right? To the Aztecs, they view this as, well, the gods have turned against us, and most of the Aztec army just goes home. So again, you've got sort of you got AM and FM that are trying to communicate with each other, and it's happening in very odd ways. Eventually, Cortez would sort of haul what's left of his army off to the south to lick its wounds, where they run into the Tlaxcalans. Okay, and the Tlaxcalans were non-Aztec people that existed essentially for the one purpose to give the Aztecs somebody to beat up on. Every year, the Aztecs would go and beat the stuffing out of the Tlaxcalans. They'd take some of their people captive to perform their human sacrifice rituals in their temples, and the Tlaxcalans had it up to here with the Aztecs. But there wasn't a whole lot that they could do about it because, the Aztecs were numerous, and they had all the military, and so the Tlaxcalans just kind of had to take it. Cortez shows up, though. Hey, you guys hate the Aztecs? Yeah. Well, we hate the Aztecs. How about you guys come with us, even out some of the numerical disparity, and we will provide the technology needed to take the Aztecs down a peg. So that's exactly what happens here is the Aztecs' enemies are going to join now with Cortez, and they're going to launch another assault a couple of years later on the capital. Cortez, attacking the capital, he builds a little sort of impromptu navy where he puts some of his cannons on it to attack the shores of the city that's on the island in the middle of the lake. And unfortunately, the Aztecs decide to fight block for block. But while Cortez had been gone, we get a nice little window into one of the major problems that existed between Europeans and American Indians cohabiting in the same place, and that's disease. Disease utterly decimates the population in the city of Tenochtitlan while Cortez is away, and so it's a much reduced, sick population that he's attacking, but they decided they're not going to give up the city without a fight, and so a lot of the city is in fact destroyed. But long story short, Cortez wins. And he sets himself essentially up as the new emperor of the Aztec Empire. So you got this guy Cortez who starts off as like middle management in Cuba, okay? And now he is the emperor of like 28 million people. And unlike the Caribbean, where you won't find gold or silver or any of that kind of stuff, in Mexico, you will find gold of it. Mountains and mountains of gold that you're going to find all over the place. And he goes and serves as this example, which is going to spur the conquistador movement, whether it's Pizarro in South America, whether it's Balboa in Panama. You'll see conquistadors of all sizes and stripes. Cortez is kind of the top of the mountain in terms of the conquistadors. He's the one that has the most success. It may be that some of the conquistadors, they only conquer a few villages in the jungles somewhere. But all of these guys are going to come over, and they are going to be sort of explorers, slash soldiers, slash conquerors, slash proselytizers of the Catholic faith. Eventually what we would see is an expansion, though, of the labor system called the encomienda system. It looks a little bit like what you and I might be familiar with to call slavery. However, the slaves, in this case the Indians, they are not able to be traded. So it's different than what when we talk about West African slavery in a little more detail. The Indians are forced to work, and you could do whatever you wanted with them if you were the encomienda leader, but you couldn't buy them and sell them. You could force them all to live in town or live all outside of town, or you say, today we're going to go mine gold, or today we're going to grow corn, or whatever. You could tell them to do whatever you wanted to, and you could sell the fruit of their labor. You could keep that for yourself, or if you said, you guys have been naughty, I'm going to cut all your hands off, you could do that too, but it wasn't exactly the same thing as slavery. And so here's a print that you have of Cortez. This is him sort of large in the frame in his suit of armor, and he's leading this charge across one of the causeways into the capital of Tenochtitlan. You can see the soldiers on these small brigantine vessels that he's constructed on the lake as they assault the island from multiple different directions, and eventually the great city of Tenochtitlan would fall to his power. Economically, all of this is going to create a system that we would refer to as the Columbian exchange. All right? And what this is a major radical shift in terms of the economic situation that had existed in the world prior to Columbus's discovery and prior to the establishment of European colonies in the New World. All right? Now, we're going to see that you've got a huge flow of goods that are taken from the New World, right, from North and South America, that are going to arrive in the Old World. A lot of it in Europe, also some of it in Africa. Now, most of this is produced via slave labor. Initially, it's going to be, for the most part, red slave labor. The indigenous American Indians are going to be used. They will eventually be replaced by black slave labor from West Africa. But the entrepot for this is going to be, for the most part, Spain. Now, these goods that are heading back from the New World to the Old World are specie, which is gold and silver. One of the, and it must be nice, you know, when you think about it for a second, oh, you just find gold on the ground, you know, you find silver in South America or something like that, just bring it back and buy whatever you want. But when you do that, you create massive inflation. You create massive amounts of inflation, and there's going to be some economic dislocation that's going to take place as a result of that. But you're also going to see goods like foodstuffs that are going to come in as well. And some of it's going to be, you know, kind of what you would expect. You know, grains and things like that are going to be moving their way into Europe for sale in order to make a lot of money, right? But also we're going to see that in some cases, brand new foodstuffs that had not existed in Europe before are going to make their intrusions. For example, the potato, right? Those of you of Irish descent say, no, potato, it goes all the way back. You can't imagine Ireland without potatoes and stuff like that. It's just been there forever. Actually, no. It's only been there for a few centuries. Thanks to its introduction from the New World. The same for the tomato. For those of you who like Italian food, tomato sauce, that's just everywhere, right? Again, it's a relatively recent inclusion into the Italian diet. If you hop into your time machine and you and Julius Caesar want to go out for a pizza, you could do it. They had pizza back then, but it didn't have tomato sauce on it. And so these are some big, big changes that when we think about sort of European cuisine, European lifestyles, just had not existed prior to the Columbian exchange. You'll also see a number of exotic luxuries like, for example, birds, different types of feathers. Monkeys are going to make their way across, but also tobacco, right? One of the other problems, of course, here is disease begins to make its way across, especially, we think, syphilis from the New World to the Old World. However, disease is going to be much, much worse going in the other direction, right? Now, what we've got going in the other direction from the Old World to the New World are colonists. both white and black, right? So you've got sort of your free colonists that are going to be moving into the Caribbean and then eventually onto the mainland of North and South America. Black slaves from Africa will eventually be populating, for the most part, the Caribbean, but also parts of South America and eventually parts of North America. Introduction of the horse. I know that most of you can't imagine it. I've seen all those old movies set in the West. You know, the Indians, they all ride horses. Their culture's built around the horse. No, not until relatively recently. All right, but the number one problem that is reaching the New World is disease. All right, and a lot of this is due to the fact that the citizens of the Old World, all right, of Europe and Africa, their bodies had developed, for the most part, resistance to disease rather than parasites. All right, and which is not to say that they were completely resistant to disease, because if you took World History 1, we talked about how the Black Plague just swept over and just wiped these people out like nobody's business. But generally speaking, that's what these people's bodies were pretty well geared more towards, was fighting off diseases. And so when diseases that are pretty bad in Europe, like smallpox, hit the New World, in some cases, entire civilizations were wiped out by old world diseases, because American Indians' bodies had developed to much better fight off parasites rather than disease. And since they were biologically isolated from the rest of human population, there was no real need to develop any immunities to diseases that they had to come into contact with. And so for tens of thousands of years, these people had lived in relative isolation. Their preparation for the types of problems, mostly parasitic, that they were going to run into, seemed to stand them in pretty good stead. But then, when diseases like smallpox, other sort of nasty diseases, chickenpox and some other things that Europeans sort of get, and then for the most part get over, hits these American Indian populations and wipes them out. Okay, now you've got varying estimates from different anthropologists on what we're talking about in terms of wiping these people out. Some say it was something like 90%, something like 95%, 98%, 99%. So it's hard to know exactly for sure without accurate census data of, well, how many people were in North America before European contact, and then how many were there later. We don't have those numbers, okay? And the reason that this is important is if it's 90% wiped out, well, that gives us an idea of a somewhat smaller Indian population. Or if it's 98% wiped out, then it's a much larger number. But we do know that there were huge numbers of American Indians that existed before these European diseases got a hold of them. Oriano refers to people living in the Amazon that were they were living all along the riverbank, sort of cheek by jowl, almost one kind of long village all the length of the Amazon River. The early explorers off the east coast of North America, that the fires of the American Indians, the campfires at night that they had in their villages all along the coastline, were so thick, the smoke was so thick from the campfires that hundreds of miles out to sea you could smell it. So there were a lot of them. There were a lot of them, and a huge majority of them were wiped out by these European diseases. So when we talk about this colonization that happens from largely Europeans moving into North America, they're moving into a space that has been made a vacuum by the death of these American Indians. So this is an important change as well. All right, this is usually where I stop the first section. So if you want to